So to spend a little bit of time looking at the whys of Judaism and as it relates to Chanukah today. I want to take a moment to thank Jack and Barbara Siegel, who are sponsoring our learning today. Le'ilui Nishmas, the Yortzah of Jack's brother Joseph Siegel, Yosef David ben Alexander Zisha Halevi, which is tonight, the first night of Chanukah. Bezras Hashem, Neshama should have an aliyah. Let's learn a little bit of Torah together and try to appreciate what's going on. So Chanukah has a lot of whys, but there's not so much written on Chanukah. Most people think they know all the whys of Chanukah but the truth is there's a lot which aren't known. So let's start at the basics and we'll try to move on from there. So why is it that we have 8 candles? You say, oh, of course we know why there's 8 candles. But let's just do a little recap, because this is not necessarily an obvious point, and so let's just go back again. We had this moment in time where the Jews were under Greek power, but let's just remember for a second, the Jews were under a foreign power for a lot of time. Meaning, the rebuilding the Second Beis Hamikdash was under the Persian mandate, and they were paying Persian taxes. They were a Persian state, and then when the Persian Empire fell to the Greek Empire, then we became Greek subjects as opposed to Persian subjects. The Greek Empire itself very soon fell into pieces. After Alexander the Great conquered the known world, he died, and all the people vying for power took different parts of his empire. So, as an example, North Africa, the area of Greece, area of Egypt, was taken by Ptolemy. Ptolemies Greeks was the north area of Africa. Then you had the Syrian area, which became the Seleucid Greeks. And then you had the Greece actually where Greece was itself. And we, as the nation of Israel, were found in between the Seleucids and the Ptolemies Greeks. And so the wars went backwards and forwards. If you read the annals of history, the Egyptian Greeks and the Syrian Greeks were fighting each other all the time. And so we, as the Jews, switched ownership quite a number of times, depending on who we were. And unfortunately, as it is with groups in the middle, we get caught between the enemies, right? But nonetheless, it seemed to be that the Syrian Greeks were dominating for a significant amount of time, and therefore we were a vassal state. The reason they were interested in us was not just because it was a land bridge to Africa, which is, remember, Israel's always in the center of the continents, right? So it's between Africa, Asia, and Europe, right? So it's that critical pathway. It's the only way through, because you can't go through the deserts of Jordan. So besides the fact that there's a land access, trade access, also happened to be that we had a temple, and the temple was filled with lots of money, because all the Jews would donate to the temple. That provided also an incentive for the Greeks, and they took over, demanded taxes and so on. At the same time, it wasn't just the Greeks. There were lots of Jews who were very happy with this way of life, and they were Hellenized Jews, including a fight for who was being Kohen Gadol. So there were groups of Jews, Hellenized Jews, who were trying to fight for the role of Kohen Gadol, and they went to Greece to promise certain amounts of money in order to be able to get the role, and they did. I mean, Jerusalem, generally speaking, the metropolis was controlled by Hellenized Jews. So it was the avant-garde, the more progressive, liberal perspective of life, whereas the backwater Jews in the villages, who drive pickup trucks, those kind of Jews were not. They were more traditional and conservative in their thinking, and they weren't so interested in this type of business. And so we had a fight not just between Jews and Gentiles, but Jews and Hellenized Jews. It was a complicated time. And so when they finally pushed the Greeks and the Hellenized Jews out of Jerusalem, and they reclaimed the temple, which had been defiled by the Greeks and established essentially as a pagan place when the Greeks were fully in control, they were trying to relight the menorah. They tried to relight the menorah. They found everything had been defiled and opened except for one cruse of oil, one jug of oil, and they lit it, and it lasted for 8 days. We will ask, why 8 days? Meaning we're just coming back to the same reason. So why 8? So there's a few reasons. One of the reasons is, the reason we're taught is because it takes 7 days to purify oneself from tumas meis, meaning everybody was impure. And so in order to purify a person, to be able to do the necessary preparation of the oil, you needed the process which is talked about in Parshas Chanukah, which is 7 days of purification, sprinkling on the 3rd and 7th day with the afer para, with the paraduma ashes in the water, and therefore to purify a person required 7 days. The 8th day was when they produced the new oil, so they needed an 8-day window. The Rakach says this slightly differently. He said that the place they used to produce the olive oil for the Beis Hamikdash was 4 days away. So it would require a 4-day trip, pressing and collecting, and a 4-day trip back. So either way you look at it, whether it was pragmatic or spiritual, there's an 8-day window in which they didn't have the oil, and it lasted that time. I was
reading last night that the menorah was actually taken by the
Yes, okay, so excellent. Yeah, so the truth is that if you want to go back into the details, which is I was going to get there in a second, but now that you mention it, a good point is that they didn't have the menorah in the base of the Mikdash when they came back. So whether it was defiled or taken, the menorah was not there. In fact, the Gemara describes this. Most people are not familiar with this because we usually get taught this what we have in nursery school, the same images of them lighting the menorah and the whole thing. There was no menorah to light. So they actually they took spears and they put 7 spears into the ground and they lit the menorah on the spears, right? Which is quite a different view. The Gemara discusses what's called a menorah shel bat, right? Which is I think it's lead, or the type of metal that was used. What was that? No, the aluminum they didn't have yet. The aluminum was very expensive. But it was what was it? Tin or lead they were using as for the poles, and that they lit the menorah as such. So it's not the image we are thinking of as the menorah, but I think it is actually a very important image because it's the image which relates to Chanukah, which is a miracle of oil and a military victory, very much more merged in the perspective that we're given. We're always given the perspective depending on who's telling the story. Just to clarify, how much this was, we dismiss all military miracles. You can hear where those kind of ideas come from. Versus it was all about military, right, to different camps in Judaism today. But it seems to be clearly that the two emerged, which is why the miracle took place on military equipment, essentially, which lasted for those 8 days. But the 8 days...
The Rav is saying basically that we celebrate Chanukah for a celebration of no change from then to now. Everything is the same. Everything is the same, precisely. We formulate our opinions and then we find the sources for them. The truth is as follows. So the importance of the 8 was the necessary stopgap. That was the necessary in between that they needed to last in order to be able to get the new oil, whether spiritually or physically. And that's why we asked 8 days, which is why it's a little bit of a problem. Actually, Rabbi Leibowitz was just in our shul on Tuesday. We had a lunch and which was fantastic, and he mentioned the following story, which is recorded in the Sefer. And I'm not sure if it's a true story, not sure if it's not a true story, but the story goes that during the Ottoman reign, so the Ottoman Empire lasted around 400 years, so the 1500s to essentially World War I, which is why World War I happened as it was falling apart. And the Ottoman Sultan had a physician who was a Jew. And this physician, he visited on Chanukah and he came to his house and he said to him, why the candles? Which is pretty easy, right? That's a underhand ball to explain. There's more complicated parts of Judaism, right? Circumcision. There's other parts which are a little more tricky to explain. But he started explaining and the miracle and the 8 days and so on. And he said, "But you're lying to me." He said, "Why?" He says, "Because there's 9 candles." So he said, no, that's just the shamash, that's just the helper candle, right? And so the Sultan thought that there must have been some sort of Jewish conspiracy. There's that they're not telling him the real reason for the 9th candle, and so he dismissed him as a doctor in anger. Now, by the way, it's always funny to me when the people think there's a Jewish conspiracy, the protocols of the elders of Zion. They don't know 2 things about Jews. Number 1 is Jews can't get together to make a meeting. And number 2 is they can't keep a secret. So it's like, how is it possible that there's one board of rabbis around the world controlling everything? It would never exist. We can't control anything, right? We can't figure out a plan for, the army in Israel. How would we be able to figure out the world? There is things like the Muslim Brotherhood, which do have longitudinal plans. That there is. But the Jews, they're not doing this, right? But nonetheless, this Sultan felt that the Jew was, this physician, his physician was lying to him, dismissed him. He was really angry with him, and he didn't know what to say. Because the shamash is just to help us. So the question is, why the shamash? Why the 9th candle? And it is a pretty good question because on a Shabbos, as an example, when we light the Shabbos candles, we don't have like a holder for the match, or a special lighter, right? The light is insignificant. Once it's finished, you just put it on the side and it's done, right? So there are a number of reasons. I'll tell you that are mentioned in Halacha. The one is a very important reason, and that is that we know that we're not allowed to use the candles. And that's because if we just use the candles, then it's not because of the miracles, because we didn't have electricity. Well, we need light. And if that's the case, then it's not because of the miracle. So therefore, it needs to be that you're using the candles specifically for the miracle. And if that's the case, you don't want to be reading next to them. So what do? You have a shamash, which is usually placed a little higher, so that if you by mistake use the light, you're not only using the light of the Chanukah candles. It sort of signifies that it's separate. However, that is only one of the reasons as well. It is also, another reason that's talked about is that there is a dispute as to whether you're allowed to madlik miner laner. Are you allowed to light from one candle to the next? And generally speaking, the way it works with fire is fire spreads without losing anything, right? But nonetheless, spiritually it's seen as a bad thing to go from one candle to another. So Shamash provides the intermediary between each candle, so you don't have to light each candle. I don't have to light from candle to candle. That's another reason. Yes.
We'll go back to last week just for a quick one.
Sure.
When you light Shabbos candles, is it the same thing that you shouldn't take the flame from one
No.
to the next?
No, that doesn't seem to be an issue. It's specifically on Chanukah. Chanukah seems to have a greater stringency on each candle being unique, the light being separate, and so on. Which is why we have the Shamash. Which is why on Shabbos we wouldn't even have that. The how we get light from one to one is less consequential than on Chanukah, interestingly enough. What happened in the end of the story, by the way? The end of the story happened is that this fellow was walking the streets. He meets somebody, an elderly Jew, who says to him, why is your face so sad today? And his answer was, he says, I just got dismissed by the Sultan, and and I'm so upset, and I don't know what to tell him. And the man said to him, I'll tell you why this is a shamash. He says, because the oil for the shamash came from the same olives that the rest of the oil came from, and yet those 8 got to be lit as the Chanukah candles, and this one is just the helper. But nonetheless, it is still happy to provide the assistance and the facilitation. So just to appreciate things as well. The shamash is sometimes the Jew who didn't make the cut, or the person who didn't make the cut to the lofty levels of the menorah, but is still sufficiently happy being the facilitator of everybody else as well, which is a very profound perspective.
Yes, so the Pach Shammah is a separate topic, what you're saying. The Pach Shammah was Tahar, but they were Tamei, so what was the point?
Oh, so it's a good question. That's a good question. So whether they found somebody who was Tahar or Tumah Hushra B'tzibur, I don't know. It's a really good question. I just want to point out an interesting point, is that I was at a Syrian bris.
Intermediary cable. They use something in between. They use it right.
Possibly. Okay, good. Then we have a solution. Not a conducting material. There happens to be, I was at a Syrian bris on Friday, and it just reminded me that there is actually an interesting practice in Syria, among Syrian Jews, which is different to regular Jews, and that is that the Syrians have 2 shamashim. Have you ever seen a menorah that is 10 candles, 8 candles, and 2 shamashim? The reason for that is a particular segment of the Syrian community that were actually exilees of Spain in 1492. When they arrived in Syria, they adopted an extra shamash as a reflection of the miracles they had been through, which is quite remarkable. So if you ever see a menorah such as that, you know it comes from Syrian, Spanish origin. Which is just to be aware of another interesting modification which exists as well. Now, why do we light a candle every night? So why is there an extra candle every night? The answer is technically speaking, you don't need to. In the sense that the Gemara says the basic mitzvah is 1 candle per house per night. So what is Chanukah? A candle by the window. That's essentially what it is. But the Gemara said that there's Mahadran, which is the better version of doing this, is that each person, it's not in an ner labais, it's ner it's for each person should light 1 candle. So if you have a house of 10 people, there'll be 10 people lighting 1 candle every night. The Gemara then says Mahadran min Mahadran is a dispute. Rabbi Sidel says we add 1 candle every night, and Beis Shammai says we diminish 1 candle every night. Why the difference between them? So whether it's that we're ascending in holiness, or whether we are looking like the Parei HaChag, the way that the sacrifices on Sukkot used to be, that were diminishing every night, whether you're counting the days that are coming in, the days that are coming out, there's this dispute. We pass, of course, like Beis Hillel, that we add a candle every night. However, it is not clear from Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai as to what they are modifying. Are they modifying stage 1 or stage 2 of that? Remember, there's 3 tiers. Tier 1 is every house requires 1 candle. Stage 2 is every person requires 1 candle. Stage 3, and let's say for argument's sake, Beis Hillel, we add a candle every night. Does that mean every house adds a candle for every night, or every person adds a candle for every night? What are they modifying? Stage 1 or stage 2? That's a debate, which is what leads the Shulchan Aruch and the Ramot to have a dispute, which is why you'll see in Sephardic households, like the Shulchan Aruch, you will see people who are lighting one menorah per household going up per night, which means that Beis Hillel was modifying the first stage of the Gemara. Whereas in Ashkenazic practice, each person, including couples as one, would be having one menorah going up, and that's because it is modifying the second stage. Each person is lighting a menorah. That's the reason for this, as it happens to be. Historically speaking, it is an interesting change, because if you actually look at the Shulchan Aruch, who is Rabbi Ya'akov Trump, who's the Sephardic posek, actually paskins like the Rosh, Rabbeinu Asher, who's an Ashkenazi posek, and the Ramah, who's the Ashkenazi posek, paskins like the Rambam, who's usually the Sephardi. So it's actually a switch in halacha, a very unusual outcome in halacha, but we're talking about traditions. The European tradition is what the Sephardim do, and the Spanish tradition is what the Ashkenazim do, as it happens to be. In this case, is a very unusual switch.
That's a miracle right there.
That's a miracle right there, yeah. Sorry.
You said one couple. So does that, going into women, is it because it's a mitzvah that says Shazman Grama, are women mechuyav?
No, good question. Yeah, so
should it be, should women, if there are daughters, if there are sons?
good question. So the truth is that it is a positive mitzvah which has it's time based, right? So it's a very specific time. Usually women would not be obligated. They can opt in, but they're not obligated in the same way. But this is not true of Chanukah, because it's called Af Heina Yuba Otzanes, which is a rule which is applied in this case, is that can be understood in two ways. Either women were facilitators of the victory, like Yehudis included as an example, or they were subject to the decrees. So we know that there was decrees about marriage, and the Greek the Greek governors taking women just as they were married. Terrible things that occurred. Either way, women are equally obligated in Chanukah, which is why all girls should light Chanukah candles. In marriage, generally speaking, usually a couple lights one menorah. Just traditionally, the man lights it. But that's not necessarily the way it has to be per se. And as an example, let's say dad is getting back from work at 11:30 at night, and nobody's awake, and the kids are going to miss it. She should light for the rest of the house. So anyways, but yes, technically everybody is chayav. There's just this notion of like a couple lighting as a unit.
So she could be machayev, she can be
yeah, sure.
The children.
100%, yeah, 100%. And that daughters of age where they can look after fire should be lighting their own candles for sure, no question. Now? This is a question which I think that you probably nobody really thinks about as well, which is, why does the menorah in my house look different to the menorah in the Beis Hamikdash? So let's just clarify this for a second. So the menorah in the Beis Hamikdash, this is one version of the menorah in the Beis Hamikdash, right? You'll notice that the menorah, the Chanukah that we have in our house, actually is different to it, right? So there's a number of reasons why it's different, but let's talk about one of them for a reason, and that is the number of branches, right? So the menorah in the Beis Hamikdash had 7 branches. It had a central stem, and had 3 branches on either side. The menorahs that we have has perhaps 1 central stem and 4 on each side. So the obvious reason the difference is because there were 8 days of Chanukah, and we need a shamash. So we need to have 8 and 9th, as opposed to 7, which is 3 and 3 and a middle one. It is worthwhile noting just something really important, and that is you're not allowed to replicate the menorah in the Beis Hamikdash, right? So we are not allowed to make a construction of a 7-branch candelabra. We learned this in halacha, actually, for those who are learning the Kitzur together, we went through this. You're not allowed to replicate the Beis Hamikdash menorah, right? And as a function of that, it's interesting to note that our menorahs are a hint towards it, but it's different. We are only allowed to construct it because it is different. So yes, it is facilitating the 8 days, but it actually has to, by nature, be different. Another difference, which is also important, which is it's worthwhile noting, that many Chanukiahs do not even have the shape. So as an example, we've all seen Chanukiahs like this, where you'll have a line of candles, and you'll have the shamash on the side. This is completely fine for Chanukah, but this is not anything to do with the menorah in the Beis Hamikdash. So just to understand, there's 2 things going on. What we're doing on Chanukah is we're replicating the 8-day miracle by lighting 8 candles and a 9th to facilitate. And some of us also have a Chanukah which looks similar to the one in the Beis Hamikdash, but it is not the same thing, because it's got a different number of branches. So just to clarify that point, and the reason obviously that it's related to the kind of the menorah in the Beis Hamikdash is because the menorah in the Beis Hamikdash is where this all took place. But just understand that it's actually different. This is not. We should not acclimatize ourselves to thinking this is the menorah in the Beis Hamikdash. It looks actually quite different, which leads us,
So
Does a non-replicating apply only to the menorah?
No, in all parts of life. You're not allowed to have a 7-branched candelabra.
No.
Yeah.
I'm saying, does it apply to any of the other kalim?
It does, but it's a little more complicated. So, for instance, a table. You're allowed to have a table in your house, right? But if you're making one specifically to the dimensions of the shulchan, the aron, of course, but the menorah is the most commonly replicated type of thing because we need light. And so it should be avoided. There's 3 prohibitions of images. You're not allowed to make the images of celestial beings, human beings, and items of the Beis Hamikdash. So when we are lighting a menorah, just remembering that it's actually altered, which is why we're allowed to do it. Which leads us to the next question, which is a very important question, which people have no idea about so much, and that is this. Is take a look at the different types of menorahs. These are different renditions of the menorah in the Beis Hamikdash. Right, so they're both 7-branched candelabras, but you'll notice the difference is one is circular branched and one is straight branched menorahs. So where does this come from? So it is interesting, if you look at the Torah doesn't tell you. Right, because the Torah in Parashas Truma, in Sefer Shmos, describes making the candelabra, describes having a central shaft and having 3 branches and 3 branches. It doesn't tell you what those branches look like. Rashi actually uses the word ba'alachson. Right, alachson means which is slanted. So that's the way Rashi describes it. And in fact, in the notebooks of the Rambam, this is a picture the Rambam has in his own notebooks on describing it. So this is the Rambam's handwriting, where he has it clearly at a diagonal slant, which is what the Rambam seems to say. However, the Ibn Ezra and many others on the Chumash point out that it must be circular, whether that was their own logic or the fact that they had historical opportunity to see this image. Where is this image from? This is the Arch of Titus, right? So when Titus and Vespasian came back from the conquest of Judea, they made a triumph. A triumph is a celebration across Rome. Usually a triumph was when you conquered a new territory. This is the only triumph which took place in Rome for quelling a rebellion, interestingly enough. But they, as part of the triumph, they set up an arch. There was an arch in Jerusalem as well, which was also set up for this, describing the victory. And on one of the sides, on the inside, is this particular facade. They also set up a temple of peace. The way the Romans understood peace was when we imposed peace. Right, so they made a temple of peace right next to it, which no longer exists today, where they displayed much of the paraphernalia. In this, it's very interesting to note that the menorah there is very clearly circular branched. It's very clearly a circular branched menorah. If you look at the coins, the earliest rendition we have of the coins, the Hasmoneans, you'll also see a curved menorah. Or some people will argue it's too straight to be curved, or maybe, but it seems that the branches of the menorah in the renditions of the Hasmonean coins is circular. There are those who doubt this, and they point out that if you really zoom in and you look at the bottom of the menorah, you'll see pagan images on the bottom of the menorah, indicating that the Romans took a little bit of license to edit, and therefore perhaps it's less likely to be trustworthy. Nonetheless, it is a debate today. You'll notice, for instance, that most traditional menorahs are circular branched, and most Chabad menorahs are always diagonally branched. So if you look at any Chabad menorah, the Chabad in the menorah in the park, the menorahs are strapped to the roofs of their cars. They're always diagonally branched. They're following the opinion of the Rambam in his notebook. Whereas the more traditional historical perspective seems to be that it was circular branched. Whether it could have been there were different stages in history, because remember that, as an example, the Gemara in Sukkah talks about there was a dispute as to how the tzitz was written. So in the tzitz it says Kodesh LaHashem. The Gemara records there was a dispute. Was it on 1 line, 2 lines? And one of the sages came back and says, "I was in Rome and I saw it," right? And that did not resolve the dispute, because it could possibly there were different versions of the tzitz throughout history, and he noticed one of them, so it could be that there were different menorahs. It's hard to know. We will know Be'ezra Hashem when the Beis Hamikdash is rebuilt, but it is happens to be something which it does inform us of a little bit of the way that we practice today. Eliezer.
Just wondering, the Arch of Titus was built 2 years after Titus died as a memorial to Titus. So it wasn't contemporaneous, number one, and therefore that's why it's different.
I don't think that's true. I'm sorry.
It's true.
I just read a book called Jews in Rome. Okay.
It was built 2 years after by his brother, after he died. That's number one. And it wasn't contemporaneous. And number two, there is a picture by Raphael that was done, that Raphael supposedly saw the actual menorah, and his picture with the Pope dressed as the Kohen Gadol and everything transferring the power from the...
Yeah. That's much later. That's already that's 1400 years later. If the arch was created by Domitian, which is his brother, that was 10 years later. So Titus died in his 40s.
Right.
So just a historical record. It's much better to trust a 10-year record than a 1400-year record. Yes.
There's a very large menorah in Israel, like in the center.
Yeah, I was trying to get that. I get distracted when people keep putting up their hands and I forget what I was about to say because I was about to get there. But yes, so the Temple Institute, takes the opinion of the rounded menorah, which is why the one in the Old City, next to where the Churva shul is the circular branched menorah, because they take that opinion as well. There are a number of other questions to be asked as well. Is that why do people give gifts on Chanukah? And so, actually, technically speaking, there is an ancient tradition, apparently, which is recorded. Rabbi Ya'akov Trump describes that there was an old process to give money for the child's Rebbe on Chanukah. Apparently, there was such to the people who teach the children, and they would send it with the children. And then he argues that the minhag evolved. That they started giving a gift to the messenger too, right? Meaning they would give a gift to the child to as well. I think the idea of Chanukah gelt is a Jewish idea, generally speaking, or at least more perhaps. But I would argue that the reason why there's Chanukah gifts today is because it's near Christmas. So meaning like it's just the Jews also wanted to get gifts, and the kids were going to public school and they needed the gifts as well, and that's nothing to do with Judaism. It's not a bad thing, but that's not, give gifts, but don't let's not confuse it with what the festival is. Give them as many donuts as they want. It's not. I don't believe it's a Jewish practice. Why do people spin the dreidel on Chanukah? So there's a lot of reasons for the dreidel. Some indicate that they had to pretend there was laws against learning of Torah, so they would have to pretend that they were gambling. I was just talking about gambling beforehand, right? So people have a love for gambling, whether it's the risk, whether it's the unknown, whether it's the fact that you don't control the outcomes, and people love that risk and experiencing that risk. Still to today, with people going into incredible amounts of debt for no good reason. And so they would pretend that they were gambling, and the dreidel was just the form of the gambling, right? As the slot machine was a little easier in those days, and this would cover up their spiritual practices that were going on. There are lots of discussions about how it commemorates the miracle, Nes Gadol Hashem, Nes Gadol Yapo, the different ideas. I did come across an interesting idea that it's Sukkos David Anofeles, which means to say it's like it relates to the idea of the Harachamanu Yakim on Sukkos David Anofeles is the dreidel, sort of a reflection of this spinning entity which only remains standing as long as it's in motion. Once it loses its motion, it falls over. And in a certain sense, we as Jews only remain standing as we remain in motion, right? So there's lots of interesting ideas. I did come across an interesting observation, which is, if you look at the way the dreidel is spun, the handle's at the top. Right, if you look at it as an example, contrasting that to a graga on Purim, the handle's at the bottom, right? Just an interesting observation. So I saw in the Sefer Tamei HaMinhagim observes that the miracle of Chanukah was very much facilitated from on top. The miracle of Purim was very much facilitated from on the bottom. And you say, wait a second, everybody was involved. There was a lot of... I thought the Hasmoneans were doing a pretty good job, right? So the point that's observed in this is that, no, in terms of the tefillah, that you see huge gatherings in the Megillas Esther to facilitate, to pray to Hashem. Here, everybody's just going to the caves and fighting. Now, that's not just, but the point is that was seen as an Isarusa, really, that it came from above, that everything succeeded, because there was many Jewish revolts and many of them failed, right? Many. And this revolt happened to succeed, but that means to say that Hashem was clearly facilitating that as well, as opposed to Purim, where there was a lot of facilitation from below as well. Fascinating way of reframing it. That's something I was going to cross. Yes?
So maybe the Chanukah gelt came from where they had to pretend they were gambling. Everyone had to bring the pruta. So
good, yeah.
If they come in, they put the money, prutas on the table, and they have the dreidel out there. Otherwise... Okay, good. So only the luckiest kids get the gifts then. Okay, there we go.
Well, the skilled kids, right? Why the donuts and the latkes? Just as a question. So interestingly enough, obviously, those are two different reasons. One is oil, and one is milchik products. Milchik products are seen as because of commemorating one of the miracles of Yehudis succeeding in intoxicating one of the Greek leaders and beheading him. But she managed to do that by first making him very thirsty. But she did that through feeding him cheese, which was cheese very salty, and which allowed him to want to drink wine, and that's when she decapitated him. So we have lots of milchik and things and latkes. It's become an entire industry, right? It's just amazing to think about. But I think it actually is important. I've been thinking about this for the last few weeks. Is the importance of lower culture. What's called lower culture means to say is not the idea itself, but the way it's expressed. And it's so important to appreciate this. So like when it talks about the Jews in Egypt, it describes that they didn't change their name, their clothes, and their language, right? That's lower culture, right? That's not the culture. That's not the ideas itself. It's how it expresses itself in a culture. That's very important. And so, for instance, today there is an Israeli culture which is independent of Judaism, but that's a very healthy thing. There's an idea that culture itself, the way we sing, the artwork we make, the way we walk, the way our slang is it's not connected directly to the ideas of the nation, but it's part of the culture, and that's how ideas survive, is through lower culture as well. And so like this is actually a very healthy thing when a culture is created, because if we don't have a lower culture that surrounds Judaism, we'll find a lower culture which surrounds other things, right? So if our kids are liking punk rock, because that's the only noise that they make. It's not music. The only noise they make when you walk into stores, they're adopting somebody else's lower culture. As opposed to, if we're going to adopt the senseless Jewish music of somebody using Jewish words just to put to music, that's still better, because that's lower culture of Judaism, right? So the idea that there's an industry of donuts and latkes is not a bad thing, right? It's just it's somebody making money on the culture around Chanukah, which is a good thing, because that means that we're adopting a culture as opposed to there's many other cultures which we're exposed to as well. Why is it that some people light by the door and some people light by the windows? So if you go to Israel, generally speaking, you walk down the street, all the menorahs are outside. You walk in Chutz La'aretz, and they're all in the windows. The truth is, the Gemara actually says that you really light by the door. As the Gemara tells us, and the reason why we light by the door is in a certain sense that it's the most public expression of the menorah. It's also you're surrounded by mitzvahs, right? So right and left, the mezuzah and the menorah. But what happened was the Gemara describes already at the times of the Gemara they had to bring it back onto the tables and light inside. The reason is because of a decree. What was that decree? So it sounds like, and this is if you read Rashi and Tosfos, this was when Persia controlled Israel. Now, Persia controlled Israel for two periods. They controlled Israel after when they destroyed the Babylonians, and there was a few hundred years there. And then later on, when the Sasanians later on took over from the Byzantines, and it was a complicated time. But be it as it may, the Persian primary religion of the Persians before they were conquered by Islam was Zoroastrianism. Zoroastrians are dualists, which means they believe in the powers of dark and light. And they have festivals. Their festivals would usually involve large torches of fire. And so they're called in the Gemara as chavarim. Not to be confused with chaverim, right? But they are chaborim. Chaborim, it's actually with a base, with a mapik, right, is actually refers to the Zoroastrians, or you see that in the Gemara language. And so the Zoroastrians would not allow there to be other lights lit at the time when they were having their festivals, so the Jews had to therefore remove their menorahs, so it receded inwards. As history continued, sometimes in the return of the lights, some of them went returned to the door, some of them returned to the window, which is as recorded in Halacha. And part of that also reflects a few other pieces. One being in other people's lands, right? So meaning not just Zoroastrians, but Cossacks, right, as an example. And another is also weather, which is that in Eastern Europe, in the further northern Eastern Europe, it's not so easy to light candles outside because they'll just get blown out. So the practice in Chutz La'aretz remained inside but migrating towards the window for public display, whereas in Israel's return, it returns to the initial practice, which was by the door as well. Which leads us to an interesting question, which is why on the left side of the door, it's supposed to be between 3 and 10 tvachim. Why is that the case? And so the Gemara tells us because you should be surrounded by mitzvahs, right?
So you have your mezuzah miyamin, menorah ala small, and you're surrounded by mitzvahs. It is interesting to observe that the Sfas Emes, the Ger Rebbe, points out that in a certain sense, metaphorically, the menorah is at the door of history. What does that mean? It is the last miracle. It is the last miracle that we've experienced as a nation explicitly. Right? Think about this for a second. So that means to say is that when we look back into history, although Purim comes, we celebrate Purim later, Purim happened earlier, right? So the last festival that we have, essentially till 1948, right, of the miracles of God's hands in history in this respect was Chanukah. And therefore it sits in the doorway as an expression of this is the doorway into a very dark outside. And we spent almost 2,000 years outside looking back at that doorway, remembering the light. That's the way he looks at it. He uses it. So the actual placement is reflecting a larger perspective as well. Why is it that we can drive on Chanukah? You know, think about this? So it's the best Yom Tov. It's like so easy, right? Orthodox traditional Jews are driving everywhere, right? It's not like Sukkot or Pesach. And the reason is because when the Torah establishes a festival, as in Parashas Emor, and describes it, it says, Kol malacha lo ya'aseh, right? Lo ya'aseh kol malacha, in Emor Perek Chav Gimel in Vayikra, don't do malacha. But when the Chazal constructed the festivals like Purim and Chanukah, they did not construct an Isra Malacha in this respect, and therefore we're allowed to do Malacha. Driving a car is a Malacha of Havara, of igniting a fly. Every time you put your foot on the accelerator, you're setting up the spark plugs to increase the piston's movement, which is allowing the wheels to move, which is a problem. Why is that we sing Haneros Halalu and Maoz Tzur? So interestingly, the text of Haneros Halalu, we don't usually have this. Like on Shabbos candles, there's no like song on Shabbos candles. We don't sing about other or make proclamations on many other mitzvahs, right? In later time, as time develops, then we added things. So like the Hasidim added L'Shem Yichud and so on. But like technically speaking, this goes actually on the times of the Tosefta already. So we're talking about 2,000 years on this. And the reason is because people light candles for all kinds of things. I was at the Syrian bris on a Friday morning, and they had a tray, which was a circular tray, a three-tiered circular tray, and they had 8 candles on each layer of that. So I asked them, is this related to Chanukah? They said, no, it's actually a tray. The word was tzanif. It's an Arabic word for a tray, and the halacha says you should light candles at a bris. So people would put money in the middle and light a candle when they give tzedakah. That's how they do this specifically at a bris. People light candles for lots of things, right? But if you don't have the dedication to this being the candles of Chanukah, it could just be you just want to have a nice environment in your room. Today we would say a romantic environment. In the old days you'd say a light environment because there was no electricity. But be it as it may, there's many reasons to light candles. So you need to dedicate the lighting of candles, which we say Haneros Halalu, and we say that text is found in the Tosefta. So it's a very important one. Maoz Tzur itself actually is more likely to be only 800 years old, which is from the times of the Rishon, the medieval commentators. And what it does is, it does a beautiful thing, is it takes all the problems or the problematic folks we've had in history, and it makes a paragraph about it, right? So Maoz Tzur starts it off. Yevonu Nikvasu Alai is the Greeks, but we have Egypt, and we have Romans, we have Greeks, we have Persians, we have all the different groups. Each paragraph describes a different part of Jewish history that we survived, and in a certain sense, there's hope because it brings us back to where we are today. You know, there was just a massacre today, right? In Australia, Hashem should protect us, but you know, we always know we win, right? In the end of the day, we always know that we're going to be trending upwards. Why do some Jews light huge menorahs in parks and others don't seem to be as interested in that? So it seems to be that this depends on it goes back to lighting in a shul. So you know that there was no practice to light in shuls. The practice was to light in homes, right? That's what the Gemara tells us. Ner ish ubeisa. It doesn't talk about the Beis Knesset at all. It not mention the Gemara whatsoever. It is recorded in halacha, and there's 3 reasons why it's recorded in halacha. So as an example, the Shibbolei Aleket says that it is because that traditionally visitors would sleep in shuls. Right, that's the way it used to be. Today there's an alarm and there's a double lock and you're a member and all the things and you know, don't touch the carpet and you know, so that's where we've arrived in our stage in Jewish history. But like I always point out, if you go to 770, that's kind of like what the shuls of Europe used to be. You know, there's a guy sleeping on 3 chairs, there's a guy eating his noodle soup, there's somebody davening right behind him, one's doing shachris, one's doing mincha, one's doing mariv. It's like it's all at one time. It's like well, it's completely haphazard, completely chaotic. There's no oversight, and people would sleep. That's what they do. They come to a town. They couldn't afford an inn. They go to the shul. They sleep on the back benches. So you'd light in the shul because there are people who are sleeping in the shul. That's what the Shibbolei Leket suggests. Another reason is, and this is brought to the Sefer HaManig, this is from the times of the Rishonim, is that the Beis HaKnesses resembles a Migdash Ma'at. So it makes sense that if we reclaim the Migdash, then we're going to do it in a Migdash Ma'at, lighting the candles. And the third reason is, and this is quoted by the Rivash in his response, where he says that it's because it's the greatest place to express a Pirusa Hanes. And so therefore we do it in such a way. So the question becomes, what happens if I can find a place where there's even more people, right? In a greater Pirusa Hanes, meaning the first two reasons of people sleeping in the park and the Migdash Ma'at don't apply to the park, right, or the sports game, or whatever else it is. But the idea of Pirusa Hanes, a lot of people, it's like you feel very proud when you see those menorahs. You drive into JFK, there's like a big Chabad menorah on the like you feel proud, right? It's like, the Muslims haven't yet invented a festival of lights in December, right? So, meaning that you feel great about this. So on the one hand, it has Pirusa Hanes. On the other hand, it doesn't have the other two reasons, which is why you'll see there's a divergence within the poskim. So the Oz Nidbaru says you will be able to say a bracha on such a public lighting because it has the same ideas as a shul, at least one of them. Whereas most of the Ashkenazic poskim will say, no, you can't say a bracha on such a thing. It's a beautiful thing, but there's no bracha said on that, which is why you'll see divergent opinions as to who's lighting the public menorah, as an example, and who's saying a bracha or not saying a bracha on such things. It's a beautiful thing, and people should continue doing it. But just understand that it comes from this interesting background as well, which comes back to the shul for a second. Why is that in some shuls you'll see the menorah this way, and some people you'll see the menorahs that way? Have you noticed that? Go to different shuls and look at the menorah in the shul. You'll see some of them face south-north and some of them face east-west, right? So why the difference? And the answer is it depends how it was in the Beis HaMikdash. The Mishnah records there was a debate as to how the menorah was oriented in the Beis HaMikdash. Was it oriented north-south or east-west? And being as that's the case, that debate actually infuses the way we light in the shuls. Arguably, in the Beis HaMikdash, it was probably both. Because in the Beis HaMikdash, if you remember, there were 11 menorahs. Right? And as opposed to the Mishkan where there was one, in the Beis HaMikdash they took the one that was in the original one in the Mishkan and they had another 10 flanking it. It is most likely, and this is what I believe, is that the menorah in the center, which is the Mishkan one, was a north-south and the other ones were east-west. Meaning to say that it was probably both, which is why there's a debate in the Mishnah. Right, they're reflecting two different parts of that practice, which is why we have it as well. Traditionally, the general way to do it is to do it with a east-west, which would be on the southern side of the shul. So, for instance, our shul faces east because we're in America. So this is east-west, and then this is south-north. Jews have to be very aware of directions and time, right? So we place on the south wall because the menorah in the Beis HaMikdash lived on the southern wall, right? The only thing just to be aware of, which is different, is that in the Beis HaMikdash, the Aron was in the west, not in the east. Just to clarify this, because we always think about it. If this were the Beis HaMikdash, the Aron, the Kodesh HaKadoshim would be in the west, not the east. We face east because we're facing Jerusalem, but west is where the Shekhinah is found, right? West in the which is the Kosel Morav is behind where the back of the Beis HaMikdash was, the epicenter of the Beis HaMikdash was. But the south would therefore, if you walked into the Beis HaMikdash, it would be on your left. But the south for us is on your right when you walk on a shul, because that's where the south is if you're facing east. But just to be aware of the different orientations or replicating of the Samisa as well. And the last thing is, why no Maseches Chanukah? If you go to the shelf and you're looking for Mishnah or Gemara, there is no Maseches on it. So part of it may relate to the fact that there is no Megillah on it either. Meaning there's no actual prophetic text which the Gemara comments on. Right? The Gemara is commenting on a prophetic text. So as an example of our Purim, we have a prophetic text called Megillas Esther, and we have a Masechta called Megillas Maseches Megillah, which relates to it. However, we have no Megillah. Yes, we have Megillas Chashmonaim, but that was written later, and it was written out without prophetic thing. Sefer Maccabim was written by a Jewish historian, and it's wonderful. There's no prophetic content there. It's apocrypha, essentially, so there's no Masechta, and that's one reason. The Sefer Tamim Menagim records the fact that the author of the Mishnah was Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. Rabbi Yehuda Nasi came from the pure blood Davidic line, and he was upset that the Chashmonaim took power, and they were Kohanim. They should not have had both kingship and priesthood.
It's a little difficult because Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, as we point out, actually comes from his mother's side. So he isn't the lines to his father's, and also to suggest that there would be such, centuries later, he wrote the Mishnah in the year 200, would have such a vendetta that 500 years later, that is a little bit juvenile to suggest that about Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. The most likely explanation is that what was under debate was not the biblical text, but really the biblical text was really translated to Greek, the Septuagint, but it was really the practice which was based on our what's called our Torah Sheba'al Peh. What was attacked was our oral Torah on Chanukah, and it's interesting that when Chanukah was redacted into a holiday, it remained an oral Torah, meaning it remained the oral Torah of the oral Torah, so much so that even when Rabbi Yehuda Nasi redacted all the oral Torah and wrote it into books, he left out one part which remained an oral Torah. So Chanukah is in a certain sense an example, which is why there's so little written about Chanukah, even though it's 8 days, as opposed to Purim, which has so much written about it. It's just one day, right? But is that we live with an oral Torah which actually exemplifies our victory over the Hellenized culture, which wanted everything written, analyzed, and compared. Whereas we still have the notion of tradition, which is oral tradition, which maintains this as well. A lot of very fascinating questions. Any further questions? Any wives on this topic? Yes, yeah.
Just have a little bit of confusion between who were the Maccabim and who were the Hashmonaim.
Good question. I also have a little bit of a confusion about this. I think that the word Maccabi actually is the name of the family was the Hashmonaim family, but the word Maccabi actually is Micha Mocha Ba'Keleb Hashem, which is an appellation which I think was given later on to them as a description, as based on their success. But what was that?
Judah.
Right, Yudah Maccabi, right? The family's actual name was the Hashmon. That's the way I understood it, as far as but I find that confusing too.
This is a really side
Yeah,
note. The Temple Institute, which I was actually going to ask before, which is why I asked if there is a prohibition on everything.
Yes.
Because what they are doing, right, is studying and recreating.
No, for sure, but they're doing that for the Beis Hamikdash, meaning they truly believe that everything that's going to be there is going to be used there.
Put things together, like they have the ingredients of the Ketores, but they haven't mixed. They don't.
Right, well, the Ketores is a separate prohibition, but like as this prohibition of not replicating the menorah, the menorah is full, right? The menorah is, it's interesting, if you want to just go back and just ask them, the Torah tells us that the menorah needs to be a miksha, right? It needs to be as one piece. So it can't be that you make separate pieces and attach them, right? So it's interesting. So Moshe Rabbeinu had trouble with this, the Rashi tells us, but nonetheless, how did the Temple Institute do it? Do you know how they did it? Really cool. So what they did was they created a wax mold, but it was an internal cast. So they created a wax model of the menorah exactly. They covered that with gold and they melted the wax internally, right? So they pulled it out. So that was the way they did it, which means it's one solid piece. I mean, not solid all the way through, but the point is it's one piece. If it was solid all the way through, you wouldn't be able to. The arms wouldn't hold up, right? Because gold is too heavy for that. But it's a layer of gold with the inside melted out. That's why it's miksha, one piece. That was the way they managed to, which is pretty ingenious. That's the one you'll see in the churva. By the churva is that menorah. There's a lot of interesting history, but if you want to research more about them, go to their website. They do a pretty thorough job explaining why they're doing what they're doing and how they're doing what they're doing and what permissions they have to do what they're doing. Some people are a little more hesitant because they're like a little too avant-garde, but nonetheless, yeah.
You mentioned east, west, north,
Yeah.
south debate in the shul, but at home, which is by the window, we don't worry about east, west, north, south.
No, in the home it's by the window. The home, the most important thing is the most public of demonstrations, if you're at least on a ground level. So that's by the window or by the door. When it comes to the shul, because the shul, the main audience is actually internal, and it's also replicating the Beis Hamikdash, you put on the south wall as well. Which is, by the way, when you're davening, if you're davening, you're supposed to go eastwards, right? At least in America or Europe. So the Gemara tells us, the Gemara tells us about Basra, is if you want to become wise, you should face the Beis Hamikdash, you should face slightly southwards. And the reason is because the menorah is in the south. We always say it's slightly to the Aron HaKodesh, but the menorah as well. So Darom is always the side of the menorah. Harot says Sheyashir Yatzbin, which is the opposite, meaning if
riches is more important to you, then go slightly north, because that's where the Shulchan was, which represents Parnasa and success as well. Yeah, no.
Yeah, just a comment on the Beis Shammai. I mean, they come up with the Pari HaChak. There's a connection also between Sukkot and Chanukah,
Yes.
like the 8 days and the 8 days.
Yes, actually, so more than I meant to mention that as another reason for the 8 as well, which is that if you read the Sefer Maccabim, if you read the book of Maccabees, when they finally reclaimed the temple, it says that the first thing they did was they celebrated the festival of palm fronds. That's what it says. Meaning they pulled out the lulavim and esrogim, which they were unable to perform, and the sukkahs, the tabernacles, they were unable to do in the caves they were hiding when this actually occurred. And when they conquered this in the winter, they celebrated an 8-day festival of their replicated sukkahs. Right? So it makes a lot of sense. I do want to just point out that the first year after, when it talks about a Shana Acheres, when it talks about the next years, it was clearly not, they did not celebrate Chanukah in houses, at least for 200 years. It makes, if you think about it, because where would they celebrate Chanukah? In the Beis Hamikdash. I mean, so the Beis Hamikdash would be the place. It was clearly at the later on that the idea of developing to the houses happened, which was another transformation of Chanukah. Meaning, as the Beis Hamikdash went away, then it became domesticated, and that's where we have the Chanukah as well. But clearly, at the beginning, it was celebrated in the Beis Hamikdash as well. Yeah.
Since everyone has an obligation to observe this, if you have a guest staying with you, do you have to sell them the candle, or they could be a part of your?
They should really light their own. If a person's sleeping by you, they should light their own menorah. If they don't have their own menorah, they can contribute funds towards yours. But really, they should be lighting their own menorah as well. Yeah.
The revolt continued after they...
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it was a pretty difficult time, and the Hasmoneans had more complicated times as well. But
They had control of the Beis Hamikdash, that was it?
no, they did have control of a significant part of Judea, and they pushed it outwards. And by the third generation of Hashmonaim, there was 5 brothers, and I think 3 of them took power. 1 was killed. 3 of them took power. Then the son of one took over. Then there was a coup, and then his son Yochanan, John Hyrcanus, he was called, took over, and he was very successful. And he pushed the boundaries north and south. He conquered Idumea in the south, and it was a very, very large conquest. So that was really the best time for the Hasmoneans. But thereafter it devolved into infighting, and ultimately their infighting led to inviting Roman, and that's why the Romans started in just before 63 BC. Yeah.
Israel, most of the residential housing you call apartment buildings. So can you put the menorah in the window on the 10th or the 15th floor?
So if it's above 20 amos, which is roughly 2-3 floors stories, then it doesn't belong in the window anymore. It belongs on the table, because the primary audience is going to be the people in the house. That's what the Shulchan Aruch says. Nonetheless, people still put it in their windows because it is possible to be seen. It's just saying that people don't usually notice it. That's what the range of vision means. So, but people usually put it in. You'll see it in the window, but technically speaking, the primary audience is internal, not external in that case. Okay, everybody say Yasha Koyach. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Chanukah Sameach. Hope it's a beautiful Yom Tov.